I'd go more in depth about these games, but I'd be here all day if I were to do that. Well, I just checked the time and would you look at that, I have all day. So, my good friends and folks, why don't you grab a beverage, grab some popcorn, and settle yourselves in for this one, 'cause this one's gonna be a fun one. Let's get started then, shall we? Dragon Quest Monsters is a monster collecting spin-off series in the Dragon Quest franchise. While extremely popular in Japan, DQM has not had as much success in the West as other monster collecting series, but isn't totally unknown to those outside of Japan in the past either. When compared with Pokemon, a lot of similarities start to appear at first, like capturing monsters and powering them up by having them battle and gain experience points. However, I would like to argue that DQM is currently succeeding and prospering, whereas Pokemon is struggling to keep its audience and retain what made it special due to stagnation. Now, I still love Pokemon, however, don't get me wrong. Gale of Darkness was one of my first entries into the series after Fire Red, and I will never forget what it did for me. It introduced me to the monster collecting game genre as a whole, and I honestly couldn't be more happier that it did. But let's take a closer look at DQM, starting with story, and then moving on to gameplay as a sufficient primer. We'll be mostly looking at Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 1 and 2 today, because those were the last officially localized games in the West. But the gameplay for further entries in the series is very similar, despite their quirks and additional gameplay mechanics. I really do wish I could cover more games, but Square didn't localize any more DQM games after DQMJ2. However, myself and a lot of other people think that's going to change very soon, because of how well Dragon Quest has been doing recently in the West, but I'll get to that later. For now, let's get on to the appetizers. Also, from now on, I'll be referring to Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 1 and Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2 as DQMJ1 and DQMJ2, because that is much easier to say than saying the full title of the game. In DQMJ1, you play as the son of Warden Trump. No, not that Trump. The leader of the Cell organization, a group of researchers focused on researching the properties of monsters. One day, you are given the task by your father to leave the research base to go to a set of islands known as the Green Bays, to go on a secretive spy mission that you aren't really told the reason for, and to participate in the Monster Scouting Challenge. The Monster Scouting Challenge is a contest where monster scouts from all around the world collect and raise the strongest monsters possible for the glory and fame in winning the tournament. You start off on Domus Isle, the main hub town of the game, where the player can talk to various NPCs, go to shops to buy weapons and accessories for your monsters, and use jet ski-like vehicles called jetties to get from island to island. Each island that the player visits, outside of a few exceptions, also has a scout post, which acts as a rest point in your adventures. Here, you can heal your monsters for free if they are wounded, store monsters that you've captured in the wild, buy new equipment and items for your monsters, store gold you found in the bank so that you don't lose half of it when all your monsters get knocked out, and acquire new monsters through trading with other scouts. By that, I meant NPCs and not actual players. Sorry to get your hopes up, people. Although it's not like you could do it nowadays anyways, because I don't know if you know this little fact, but yeah, Nintendo kinda discontinued their Wi-Fi services. for the original Nintendo DS a long time ago. You can also participate in various side quests via the Scouts Den, located in the back. There's one more service offered in Scout Posts in the form of synthesis, but I'll come back to that as that's a major gameplay mechanic. Anyways, your main objective is to compete in the Monster Scout Challenge, grow a team of powerful monsters, complete your father's mission, and become the Monster Scout champion in the tournament. As for the sequel, it should be noted that DQMJ2 is not a direct sequel to the first game, as you play as an entirely new character this time around. This time, the story is set days before the Monster Scout Challenge, and you as the player wish to be the tournament champion. You leave town and stow away on an airship called the Albatross to arrive in Green Bays, but are mysteriously and abruptly shot down by a freak lightning storm before it can arrive there. When you regain consciousness, you realize that the Albatross has crash-landed onto a seemingly abandoned island filled to the brim with monsters. Before you leave the ship, you take notice that most of the crew seems to have gone missing after the crash. Your task now is to scout monsters and grow your team, explore various areas on the island like the Doubtback, Isolation, Cragravation, and much more, find the missing crew members of the Albatross, bring them back to the safety of the airship, solve the mystery of the island, and eventually make your escape to participate in the Monster Scout Challenge. Yeah, Dragon Quest likes puns, can't you tell? Chugga Conroy would absolutely love this series. In terms of improvements, DQMJ2 offers a wider selection of monsters, with some of them coming from Dragon Quest IX, which was fairly new at the time, the introduction of giant monsters in monster sizes, more side quests, and a much more expansive post-game than what the original Joker had to offer. I would definitely recommend playing both games, but I have to say that DQMJ2 vastly improves upon what the original had in terms of content. In terms of story progression, the original DQMJ let you explore Green Bays with a little more freedom, as you could visit some areas before the story directed you to go there to see what monsters the islands had. On the other hand, some islands and areas required you to progress the story for you to get full access to them. DQMJ2 had a more linear progression, with each area being tied to the next one through story progression. Each of these areas also has their own story events in them, but still manages to fit into the bigger picture without taking anything away from it, which was really a nice refreshing take on linear storytelling. With Pokemon, it's usually the tried and true formulaic journey through the region over and over again. You start your Pokemon journey, catch Pokemon for your team, visit various towns, battle trainers, make your Pokemon stronger, collect gym badges, stop an evil team from endangering the world, and then challenge the Pokemon League to become League Champion, in that order, with extra pickles and fries cooked animal style. You see, that sort of story is fine the first 1 or 2 times, but it gets kind of stale after a while without variation. Sun and Moon tried to break the formula a bit to its credit with totems instead of gyms, and its own form of island hopping, but I feel like it didn't do quite enough to break the mold and help the Pokemon series grow into its own. With Dragon Quest monsters, its storytelling is quite varied and does not limit itself to the same formulas for its narrative journeys, whether that be saving the world from darkness, uncovering the mystery behind a giant island, or going on a mission to rescue your sister from monsters in a remake of the original Dragon Quest monsters for the 3DS. Now, on to entree number 1, the gameplay. Dragon Quest Monsters is generally a series all about collecting monsters and making them stronger, but this time, it's with monsters from Dragon Quest, obviously. And let me tell you, my friends, there are a lot of monsters for you to train and collect, with 215 in the original Dragon Quest Monsters Joker, and a whopping 311 in the sequel, DQMJ2. In order to battle monsters, you simply have to run into them on the overworld. Yes, unless your ears are full of wax, you heard me right. You can actually see the monsters before you battle them, a feature that's been absent from Pokemon up until the newest entry in the series, Pokemon Sword and Shield, with, let's just say, mixed results, to put it lightly.
Oh, no, 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 no. Look at the top of his head!
You usually start out with a few simple monsters, like a slime, a hammerhood, a platypunk, or a Draki, but those four are more than enough to get you started. Unlike Pokemon, which requires you to buy Pokeballs and weaken the Pokemon to catch monsters, you acquire new beasties through a process called scouting in Dragon Quest Monsters. Scouting is where the game takes all the strength of your monsters and then makes them display a show of force to the monster you wish to scout. These attacks do no damage, thankfully, as they're merely showing their power. There's a meter in the top right or left corner displaying how much the monster is impressed with you. It ranges from 0%, which is to say, you suck, all the way up to 100%, which means that the monster is really happy with your display of power and will gladly join your ranks. The higher the scout percentage, the more likely it is that you will scout the monster, but you can even scout a monster with just 1% if you're really lucky. There are other ways to increase your chances of scouting monsters, like through the use of various items like monster meat, which gives you an automatic 20% even before you start scouting, and using buffs like tension and spells like oomph to increase your overall damage output. You can also have 3 different monsters out at any given time, which also helps with the scouting process, as some of the monsters later in the games have really high defense. You can have 4 different monsters in the later games, by the way, which also helps speed up the process even more. Pokemon, however, is a more 1v1 focused game with double, triple, and other types of gimmick battles added in on top of that. For catching Pokemon, you just go into wild grass, encounter a monster, weaken it, and then throw a Pokeball at it. Looks like not very much strategy when compared to DQM, outside of finding what type the Pokemon is weak to and maybe inflicting it with a status ailment like sleep or paralysis. But despite the repetitive nature of it, it's simple and easy to understand, and you know what? I can respect that. Going back to battles for a moment, outside of the successful genre of double battles, Pokemon has been infamous for adding gameplay elements for one generation and then neglecting to expand upon them in subsequent games. Or you know what, how about just flat out not including them at all? Take triple and rotation battles from Generation 5, for example. These were great additions to Pokemon, but after Generation 5, it was just kinda like the developers forgot they even existed, or just neglected to even improve upon the features because they just didn't care for some reason. This behavior is personified even further with the exclusion of Mega Evolutions and Z-moves from Sword and Shield, and it basically communicates to the fans that Game Freak can't decide on what they want to include in Pokemon. With Dragon Quest monsters, the developers make sure that they at least take elements from the previous games, and then introduce them in a similar way to how they were previously, with some much appreciated improvements this time around. One idea that immediately comes to my mind is how they expanded the concept of giant monsters, originally implemented in DQMJ2, and then polished that mechanic in DQM Terry's Wonderland for the 3DS, allowing for even bigger beasties that take up to 4 party slots. Then there's the various improvements made to synthesis throughout the series titles. But I'm getting ahead of myself, let's get back to gameplay for now. Don't worry though, we'll come back to these concepts in a bit. Returning to gameplay, after you've successfully scouted the monster you wanted, you can give it a name and then look at its stats. Monsters have all the traditional stats that most RPGs have, like strength, speed, HP, and all that funky jazz, but where it gets really interesting is the type, or rather, polarity, a certain monster has. This is represented by either a blue plus mark, a red minus mark, or both, but colored with green and named as neutral. We'll get to what these polarities mean in a moment, but there's one more thing that I'd like to cover before we get into that, and that's skill points. I know I'm saying that we'll come back to these certain concepts a lot, but just roll with me here, alright fam? When your monsters gain enough experience points from battles, they level up and gain stat points. On top of that, every couple of levels, your monsters gain skill points, a separate stat from the rest, which also can be allocated into different skill trees to learn new spells, abilities, and just overall increase the stats of the monsters. There are also natural traits, which are unique qualities or abilities that monsters have, like for example, the Magic Scrooge trait, which has all magic point consumption when casting spells, or just using abilities in general, or the Critical Massacre trait, which doubles your monster's chances of getting a critical hit. I suppose now would be a great time to talk about monster sizes, as it ties in with traits and skill trees. In DQMJ2 and onwards, monsters were given different size classifications depending on how big they were. Small monsters take up 1 slot, medium monsters take up 2, giant monsters take up 3, and then finally, the really thick monsters take up 4. Medium monsters, even though they take up 2 party slots, are more powerful, a little more tanky than small monsters, yet still allow the room for 1 or 2 more supporting monsters like a healer or a magic caster, just for an example. Giant monsters, as stated beforehand, are monsters that take almost all, if not all of your party slots, but offer extremely powerful attacks, unique skill trees in some cases, and are able to have more traits than small and medium monsters. The same applies for 4-slot monsters, so you know what? Go have fun and go wild with that. Whereas with Pokemon, its new Dynamax feature in Sword and Shield just feels like another tacked-on gimmick, because it's just the Pokemon rescaled to be giant and given a fancy red aura, with some new moves thrown in. With giant monsters, you actually have to think and use your brain about how you want to use them, due to the party slot consumption. There is an actual trade-off for gaining more power and abilities, which adds an element of risk versus reward and extra strategy. Whilst with Dynamax and Mega Evolution, the only thing the player might end up sacrificing is a turn to complete the transformation. Going back to skill trees, once you hit certain skill point thresholds in a skill tree with your monsters, like for example 10, 20, 35, etc., your monsters gain new spells and abilities. With spells, the naming convention changes as well to represent the strength of the spell. Like Zap, which is a lightning spell, going to Zapple, and then eventually Kazap, and then finally Kazapple at its most powerful form. You can also gain skill points through a consumable item called a Seed of Skill, which can give you an additional 1 to 3 skill points per seed. With Pokemon, in Generation 5, starting with Black and White, Pokemon were given access to hidden abilities that can only be gotten once certain conditions were met, like breeding for them, or obtaining special Pokemon with them through Nintendo Wi-Fi events. These abilities, in some cases, were very valuable to certain Pokemon, and allowed some to become very overpowered and broken. Despite this, it never attempts to expand on this concept and say, give the player a new way to learn moves. You're just limited to learning new moves through level ups and TMs, and even that is somewhat limited depending on the Pokemon in question, as Pokemon are restricted to the moves in their move pool. Pokemon could at least try a new and exciting way to learn moves, as we've had the same kind of move tutors, the same types of TMs, and move pools only get small updates here and there every once in a while. Yeah, to its credit, Pokemon does have really technical stat growth customization in the form of EVs, or effort values, and IVs, or individual values. These values are numbers that dictate a Pokemon's stat growth, so that people can maximize just how much they can get out of their monsters in terms of potential. However, that's something that a lot of the Pokemon fanbase doesn't know about, or have cared about outside of the competitive Pokemon scene. With skill trees and Dragon Quest monsters, it streamlines the overall process of making your monsters stronger, allowing everyone to enjoy what the system has to offer. Yet, it still manages to have quite a lot of depth to it through just how customizable you can make your monsters into certain roles through traits combined with skill trees. Some of these roles include Healer, DPS, Tank, and Magic User, with maybe a combination of these different roles listed. Albeit in Pokemon, your monsters are limited to maybe 1 or 2 roles due to having 1 or 2 stats that a Pokemon can excel in, and that's all the player gets, which can result in formulaic combat. In DQM, you take a few moments in the menu, allocate your skill points into skill trees, maybe learn a new trick or two, and then carry on with your adventure. With Pokemon, even including features like Super Training added in games like Pokemon X and Y in 2013 to help speed up growth, it can take days or weeks even to get your monsters to where you want them to be. And here's the kicker! I haven't even gotten to the huge part of Dragon Quest Monsters gameplay. I've still got plenty to cover, in fact. But I think I've covered the gameplay mechanic of skill points sufficiently now. So let's move on to what I think is the biggest part of Dragon Quest Monsters: synthesis. Remember how I mentioned earlier that monsters have their own polarity separate from their stats? Well, this is where that finally comes into play. Sure, leveling up your monsters and allocating skill points into skill trees to learn new spells, abilities, and stat growths helps your monsters progress and evolve, but there's only so much a monster can improve before it reaches its limits. Whether that be the level cap, or the monster is too weak strength-wise and the enemies become too strong for it to handle. The question then becomes, where do you, the player, go from here? The answer is synthesis, of course. Synthesis is the process of taking 2 monsters and combining them together to create a new one, with stronger capabilities, bigger stat growths, and in some cases even, new abilities exclusive to that certain monster. The only 2 prerequisites for synthesis to occur are for both monsters to be at least level 10, and that the 2 monsters must be of opposite charges. So you can't fuse a positive polarity monster with another positive, for example. Neutral charge, or plus-minus monsters, can only be fused with either a positive polarity monster or a negative polarity monster. There are also monsters that are not able to be found in the wild, and can only be gotten through synthesis, and some of them even require specific individual monsters, and not just any 2. The 2 monsters used for the synthesis are designated as parents, while the new one is designated as the child. After you combine your monsters, you are given the choice of what skill trees to carry over. However, you aren't allowed to transfer every single skill tree that you wish, as you are limited to 3 total. You also cannot transfer over traits, as that would just be extremely busted and game-breaking. This makes the player think carefully as to what role they want their monster to excel in, so that they aren't absolutely overpowered in everything, but instead are more suited to a specific role within your team, like what I said earlier with skill tree customization. After you've carefully pondered over what you want, you combine your monsters into a new one. As a result of this happening, your new monster is reset to level 1, and the 2 monsters you used in the synthesis are now gone. Now, I see you getting your pitchforks and torches, yelling and screaming at the fact that you have to grind back up to the point where you were with your monsters. But hold on! You see, the process of leveling in Dragon Quest monsters is actually quite straightforward and satisfying, believe it or not. Synthesized monsters gain 40% more experience points than those that were just scouted in the wild. Also, in order to expedite the amount of time leveling your monsters, there are special enemies called Metal Slimes, which give out a lot more experience points on defeat, but are very skittish and will run away maybe 50% of the time if you're not fast enough. There are even traits like Metal Masher, which deals more damage to Metal Slime type monsters to help with that. One point I will give Pokemon, however, is that it does have multiple ways to level up your monsters. Whether that be through the use of items like the Lucky Egg, an item that multiplies the experience gained by 1.5 times, and Rare Candy, which just flat out gives you a level. The player can also hunt a Pokemon called Audino in the later generation games, a Pokemon that also gives a sizable amount of experience points on defeat. But then again, since DQM lets you have multiple monsters in battle at any given time, that lessens the amount of time spent leveling significantly, and even more so if you're just doing one monster at a time. On top of that, all monsters you have, whether they are in your reserves or in storage, all gain EXP, no matter what, albeit reduced. That is also something that Pokemon lacks that is sorely needed, in my opinion, as it can take quite a lot of hassle to get your Pokemon to max level, even with what I've mentioned beforehand. Oh, and if you don't feel like manually entering in commands for your monsters, you can use tactics, which are pre-made automatic orders that affect how they behave in battle, like going all out, focusing on healing, or casting buffs to help your party, which to my knowledge, Pokemon lacks any sort of auto-battle feature for leveling efficiency at all to this very day. The AI for auto-battling, although it isn't perfect, does what it needs to do quite well, and that is better than not having it at all. So, you can either spend a few 30-minute sessions here and there, leveling and optimizing your monsters in Dragon Quest monsters, watching them learn new abilities, spells, and just have a great feeling of satisfaction from all your hard work in general, or you could spend potential days of resets looking for just the perfect natured Pokemon that affects just the statistical numbers of your monsters, and then spend even more time leveling it up to max level. As for synthesis, Pokemon has breeding? Yeah, you're not winning this one, sorry. Sure, you may be able to obtain abilities and moves from breeding that you couldn't normally get otherwise, improve the stats of the monster, and potentially get a nice recolor after potential hours of shiny hunting through the Masuda method, but that's as far as the concept of breeding goes. To be fair, I wouldn't want to see what an Arceus combined with a Trubbish would look like either. Ugh. I should also mention that each and every monster has their own family, like Slime, Dragon, or Nature for a few examples. This determines what elemental weaknesses and resistances they have, and what synthesis results they can yield. Okay, so that's the last major gameplay mechanic covered for DQM, but there's one last category that I wish to cover, and that is graphics, animations, and game versions. I also have an absolutely excellent document by GameSpot if you wish to learn more about synthesis in the description below. Graphically, Dragon Quest Monsters games hold up quite well, even after, say, 7 to 8 years after it's released, like a fine wine and cheese pairing. Akira Toriyama's art style is an unmistakable classic art style, and it works wonders for not only Dragon Quest, but Dragon Quest Monsters as well. You can really tell that he put his heart and soul into his work with the DQM games, and it shows. The color palettes used for different locations and islands in DQMJ1 are extremely detailed, vibrant, and varied for DS games at the time, with maybe a few exceptions that look bland. Like Infern Island, which mostly consists of tones of gray and dark colors, and may come across as boring to some people. However, the reason why Infern Island looks the way it does is because of plot details that I will not spoil here. The same vibrance shown in DQMJ1 also applies to DQMJ2 and the later games, thankfully, with some nice touches in color and graphics here and there to boot. To its credit, Pokemon does a decent job with its visuals, despite some rough edges on occasion. Then we get to the animation. Oh boy, this ain't looking good, folks. And spoilers, it's not Dragon Quest monsters that I'm talking about here. Before we get into this, I just want to say that I have no ill will towards Game Freak, and I just want to see them improve, to be totally honest. With that being said, for years Pokemon had static animations for its monsters, with the Pokemon just completely standing still, waiting for you to give it an order. It wasn't until Pokemon Emerald in the mainline series that monsters started showing any hints of animations, with little animations playing when the monster is sent out of its Pokeball, only for it to go back to being static again. This would later be revamped in Pokemon Black and White, or Generation 5, in September of 2010, where monsters finally got their own custom idle animations. Mainline Pokemon games have been notorious for having inattentive animations, which makes battling seem kind of stiff from time to time. This unfortunate trend has continued on to present day, with Pokemon Sword and Shield, which has some questionable animation choices. It isn't until you look at the side games, like Pokemon Colosseum, XD Gale of Darkness, and then Battle Revolution in the early and mid-2000s, that you realize just how much wasted potential the series has in terms of its animation. In these side games, Pokemon actually walk up to their opponent's monsters and hit them. The move animations are detailed, and most importantly, they don't feel stiff. And get this, these games weren't even developed by Game Freak themselves. They were developed instead by Genius Sonority, who, funnily enough, also helped with the development of Dragon Quest Swords back in 2007. It's quite frankly embarrassing how detached Game Freak appears to be with its animations, seemingly reusing animations from the 3DS era of Pokemon games for Sword and Shield. Instead of being this nonchalant and trying to pass it off as high-quality animations, Game Freak should really have more animation staff on hand to accommodate for the number of Pokemon in each subsequent game. Money should not be an issue for Pokemon, as it is a multi-million-dollar franchise. When a second-party developer can do a better job of animating games than the original creators, and there's nothing wrong with being second-party, mind you, there has to be something amiss. I'm not saying that to be mean, but it's the cold, hard truth. Returning to Dragon Quest monsters, you can see that animations are well thought out and fluid. Spells are very flashy and stylish, and you can actually see your monsters go up to attack your opponents in battle. That just goes to show that the animation staff behind the DQM games really do care about how their games look and feel, whereas that aspect seems to be slowly fading away with Game Freak as time goes on with the Pokemon franchise. Moving on to game versions, Pokemon has always been known to divide games into two separate versions, gating off content to be exclusive to one or the other. This is usually followed by a third release, coming out 1 or 2 years later sometimes, with substantial improvements and new content added in. This business practice is seen by some as greedy and dated, because a player will most likely have to buy both versions of the game to get all the Pokemon. After that, they will have to either tediously transfer monsters using the Pokemon Bank from generation to generation, or deal with people's ludicrous demands on the Global Trade Center, or whatever trading service the current generation has, to get all the Pokemon they need. People who've wanted a Darkrai for a Bidoof in exchange back in Diamond and Pearl, you know who you are. DQM, on the other hand, has not really been known for this particular tactic outside of a few exceptions, like the professional versions of Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2 and 3. Much like Pokemon's typical third versions, these games offer significant improvements when compared to the originals, with new monsters and story content. But due to them never officially releasing outside of Japan, the rest of the world never really got to experience these games, outside of the people who used English translated patches through emulation using modified DS and 3DS consoles. That practice in itself may be seen as morally questionable. However, what other option do people have if the media in question is not available in their country, as buying a separate Japanese console and game can be expensive, let alone inconvenient? I do have to admit that Pokemon has been spot on with localizing its titles in its long history, as they never really missed a beat with releasing Pokemon games almost everywhere on the planet. Dragon Quest has started to clean up its issues with lack of localization outside of Japan in recent years, but it's important to note details like these. The concept of emulation is a very gray area in the games industry, but that's a discussion for another time. I think we've covered just about everything besides music. The DQMJ games have some decent tunes, but I will admit that it can get a bit repetitive when you hear the same island tune and dungeon music in the first game. Barring some omissions, like the main town theme, Infernile, and the final dungeon of the game, with some minigame music thrown in there for good measure. The sequel fixes this problem and diversifies the soundtrack a lot more, thankfully. There are definitely some very catchy tunes if you listen to them enough, like the Wild Monster Battle theme, and the Monster Scout Battle theme. I'm totally fine with some tracks being reused if they are remixed or remastered, but some new compositions for the next DQM game wouldn't hurt. It took some time to listen to the soundtracks from games like Terry's Wonderland 3D and the DQM2 remake, and those are exemplary. Listen to them if you have the time to do so. I highly recommend it. Music is one area that Pokemon has never really struggled in, so I'll give it that one too. I firmly believe that Dragon Quest Monsters is a monster collecting series of video games that everyone should enjoy at some point during their gaming hobby. It's a truly addictive and thrilling experience to its very core with each and every game. Despite the lack of localization for later titles, there are still plenty of games to enjoy, whether that be the first two Joker games, English translated patches for the later games, or the older DQM games for the Game Boy Color. However, as stated before, Dragon Quest has been cleaning up its issues with localization in recent years, with more and more titles being released for audiences outside of Japan. Square Enix even announced that there would be a new Dragon Quest Monsters game for consoles to celebrate the franchise's 20th anniversary, starring a younger version of both Eric and Mia from Dragon Quest XI as your protagonists. Judging by how well Dragon Quest XI sold in the West, and by extension, how Dragon Quest XI's will sell this September, I can say with confidence that the dark age of Dragon Quest localization is finally coming to a close. On top of that, there's also the hero's inclusion into Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which is huge bonus points for the series all around. Dare I say that we might just see Dragon Quest Monsters' grand return to the West after an 8-year-long drought of no new entries outside of Japan. If Digimon can make a comeback, so can Dragon Quest Monsters. This new game, when it arrives in the West, will serve as an exemplary foothold for future titles in the series to come overseas. It could also give Pokemon a run for its money, or at least some friendly competition, due to how disgruntled and torn apart the Pokemon fanbase is currently. As much as I hate to say this, I really do think that Pokemon's reign over the monster collecting genre of video games may be ending soon. Unless something is done in the near future to correct the mistakes and blunderings of not only Sword and Shield, but past entries in the series in terms of monster inclusion, animation, and any other flaws not listed here, that is. I really hope Pokemon can learn from its mistakes and possibly take note of how Dragon Quest Monsters does things, because it feels like there isn't much time left. So, with all that being said, I humbly invite you to stay tuned for next time, where we take a look at all the details for this new game, and the prosperous future that Dragon Quest Monsters could have in the rest of the world, in the next video I have planned, titled The Next Generation of Dragon Quest Monsters. I hope you all really enjoyed this video, as I put everything I had into this one, including my vocal cords. I've been wanting to do a video on Dragon Quest Monsters for ages, as not very many people have really gone in depth with this spin-off series in particular. With the recent controversies surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield, coupled with the announcement of a new game in the DQM series, I thought this was the perfect time to do so. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, as that helps me out a lot with growing my channel. I also have my own Discord server in the description below, so feel free to join that. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all next time. I'm going to go rest my voice now.